LiSTNR production.
A warning. This episode contains descriptions of violent crime. Please listen with care. Do you remember when the internet erupted in 2018 over whether a viral audio clip was depicting the name Yanny or Laurel? Or how over 20% of people are convinced ABBA is singing "See That Girl, Watch Her Scream," kicking the dancing queen, instead of the actual lyrics, "See that girl, watch that scene, dig in the dancing queen." These playful debates light up our social media feeds, but what happens when misheard words have far more serious consequences? Like in a videotaped murder confession or a panicked emergency call. Dr. Phil Rose is a speech scientist specialising in forensic voice comparison and disputed utterances. In this episode, discover why no one can say the same word twice in exactly the same way, explore the limitations of ear witness accounts, and delve into the implications of deep fakes on the future of forensic voice identification. My name's Catherine Fox. I'm a former GP, crime author and screenwriter. I'm enthralled by forensics and have spent thousands of hours researching for books and screenplays. So I thought, why not turn my research into a podcast? Every week, you'll be joining me in discovering how forensic science is helping solve high-profile crimes in Australia and around the world.
There are several main areas of forensic speech science. Probably the most common one that we come across is speaker identification. We call that actually forensic voice comparison. And that's when you have a speech sample from an offender and you have a speech sample from a suspect, and you have to compare them to help the trier of fact determine whether in fact the suspect said the offending speech or the incriminating speech. Another area that comes up quite a bit is the disputed utterances, when it's not the case that we want to know who said something, but we want to know what was said. So a recent case in point was the chant at the Opera House in the pro-Palestinian rally just before Christmas, where it was claimed that "Gas the Jews" was being chanted, and other people had ideas that something else was being chanted.
What were the implications of what was actually said?
If you chant "Gas the Jews," that's an incitement to violence, and that's a crime. But anyway, that's disputed utterances. Then one can have whether a recording has been tampered with or not. So it's quite easy these days to manipulate a recording to make it sound as if it's something else, either to make it sound incriminating or to make it sound non-incriminating. And quite often one is asked to look at to listen to a recording and or examine a recording and say whether you think something's been tampered or not.
I noticed you said comparison, not identification.
Yes.
Was that a deliberate?
Absolutely.
Well, my first question is, how unique are our voices? How identifiable are our voices?
Well, it's claimed everywhere, isn't it, that we all our voices are unique. But if you think about it a little bit, it's like fingerprints. You can't go and compare everybody's voice with every other person's voice on this planet, because for a start, there are quite a lot of people who are no longer alive, and humans have been speaking for a long, long, long time. So you can't do that to work out whether indeed people have unique voices or not. So it's what we call an inductive truth, like fingerprints. From experience, we assume that individuals do speak differently. But from a forensic point of view, that's not going to be a useful assumption, because we could only maintain that people speak individually if we have an enormous amount of data from them, speaking under different circumstances in different ways.
So In terms of our voices, what actually influences the sound that we're producing at any moment? How variable can they be, our own voices?
Well, the sound that you produce when you speak comes out of your mouth, comes out of your nose, and is radiated also from your larynx. And that's nothing but a disturbance of the air that is produced when you push air through your vocal tract and you modify it by putting your tongue in different positions to produce different speech sounds, and you make your vocal cords vibrate at different frequencies to produce differences in pitch. Now, the sound that's picked up at a microphone when you speak, or the sound that goes into your ear, is a function then of the size and shape of your vocal tract, basically. That's the basic thing. So if you know the size and shape of your vocal tract when you speak, you can predict what the acoustics will be. But it's a lot more complicated than that, because you never say the same thing in exactly the same way, ever. Humans can't do that. We're biomechanical mechanisms, and even if we say the same vowel, like E on E, 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 it will always be different, because we can't put our tongues and our vocal tract in exactly the same place on two different occasions. And also, your brain is working in a different way on each occasion too. So there's always variation in speakers' outputs. And there's going to be greater variation on two different occasions, which is what we're always talking about forensically, because you've got the crime recorded and you've got the suspect speaking in a police interview or whatever. That's two different occasions. And so you would expect, even if they were the same speaker, you'd have differences. So what you have to do with this between speaker and within speaker variation, you have to say, right, I'll compare the offender speech with the suspect speech. There will be differences between the offender speech and the suspect speech, even if they're the same person. You measure those differences. And then you say, what's the probability of getting those differences, assuming that they'd come from the same speaker? So what's the probability of getting the offender speech, assuming it's come from the suspect? And it's if you have a model of the suspect's voice, it's easy to say what the probability is of getting the offender speech, assuming it's come from the suspect. So you have one probability there. Then you say, right, that's not the only thing I need to find out. I want to find out what's the probability of getting the offender speech, assuming it's come from somebody else. And in order to do that, of course, you have to have a model of the somebody else, which means a whole lot of other speakers who are speaking similar to the offender, and you have to work out what the probability is of getting it, assuming it's somebody else. Then you end up with two probabilities. You then take the ratio of those probabilities, and that gives you the strength of evidence. So you might find then that you're 100 times more likely to get the offender speech, assuming it's come from the suspect rather than someone else. But anyway, that ratio is your strength of evidence, and that's what the forensic speech comparison person, or forensic voice comparison person, tries to find out. What you've got there then is something called a likelihood ratio, and you would report that likelihood ratio verbally in the same way as I've just done to you. Now, you're 100 times more likely to get the difference between the suspect and offender, assuming the offender speech has come from the suspect rather than someone else. Now, the likelihood ratio is probably the worst termed thing in forensics because of the word likelihood. And we think of likelihood in normal English, don't we, as a synonym of probability. You know, what's the likelihood of rain tomorrow? What's the probability of rain tomorrow? But it's not that. And that's where it gets dangerous, because what I've been talking about is the probability of the evidence, assuming the hypothesis. So what's the probability of getting the difference between the suspect and offender speech, assuming the suspect and offender are the same person? Crudely, it's like saying, how many other people could have said this, including the suspect? God knows. I wouldn't know. The police probably know, the trial, the jury at the trial probably know after they've heard other evidence saying, oh, well, there's only 2 other people it could have been on the basis of other evidence, right? But the forensic practitioner doesn't know that, and they don't want to know that, right? They don't want to know. They have got no idea. All they can give you is the strength of evidence. Then you can combine the strength of evidence with the prior probability, and you can get a posterior probability.
How do you go with families? Because we all know fathers and sons who sound very, very similar over the phone, or mothers and daughters, same expressions, same intonation, same cadence. How do you go when you're given a piece of evidence and there's a possibility of family members or someone who sounds very similar? How do you go about your comparison? Does that make any difference?
Yeah, it usually makes it much easier.
Really?
Yes, because I was saying before, you have to, one part of the job is to estimate the probability of getting the difference between the probability of getting the offender speech, assuming it's come from someone else, right? So that's if you want to think of it that way, that's your defense hypothesis. It's not my client, it's somebody else, or it's not my client, it's somebody who sounds like him, which is much more sensible to think, right? Now, to evaluate that, then the poor old forensic voice comparison expert has to go out and record a large number of other speakers so that they can say, what's the probability of getting this, assuming it's come from somebody else?
How large a sample would you need? How many people would you need to record?
That's a really good question, and it depends on what you're actually comparing. Most voices are, from the point of view of their acoustics, most voices are fairly similar because we're not all running around. Some speakers are not running around with 5 metre long vocal tracts, right? We've all got more or less the same size heads and the same size vocal tracts, so we output more or less the same sounds. That means then that if you go and measure 30 speakers and you get their average distribution and so forth, if you go and measure another 30 speakers, you probably are not going to find out much more. So, 30, 40 people, of course, people have done testing on this, and depending on what you're actually measuring, it would be nice, let's say, to have between 30 and 60 other speakers. That would give you a good idea of the distribution of the features in the population.
One of the problems that I can foresee is that if, for example, you're looking at a recording of people committing an act or planning an act, phone recordings or taped recordings, the vocabulary used is often not extensive, let's be honest. In criminal recordings, often that I've heard, there's a lot of expletives, there's a lot of shortcuts, there's a lot of yeah, nah, swearing, and often in the tapes there's so much of that and very little of cogent sentences strung together. So how do you learn about grammar, the way they say phrases, if there's this sort of shortcut? And we've all had people, at the pub, yeah, nah, and they have these conversations that not much is said. So how on earth, with limited words spoken but repeatedly, do you establish who is the speaker?
So you're really asking what we measure. And I would love to have lots of years. Oh dear me! Because usually you measure the acoustics of vowels. And for example, in something like yeah, well, let me explain that in greater detail. Okay, so when you produce a vowel, you put your tongue in a particular position, and the air in your vocal tract vibrates at different frequencies depending on the position you put your tongue. And those frequencies are called, they're resonances of the vocal tract, and those frequencies are called formants. And it's very easy to measure formants from just standard acoustic software. And so you measure the formant frequencies in a vowel like E or R or I. It's fairly easy to measure those. And so if you've got, let's say, 5 years, or 6 I's in the same word or different words, then you measure those vowels, you measure the formants in those vowels, and you get the average formant, and that's what you use to compare. So it's not the fact that they're saying the same word is rather good. It means you've got a fairly controlled vowel production. The trouble is with if you look at the same vowel in the offender speech, it might occur in different words, and the fact that it occurs in different words will change the vowel acoustics a little bit. So if you take, let's say, the vowel I, and you put it in the word like, then it will be slightly different from if you put it in the word time. At the beginning and at the end, it will change, right? So you have that variation that I talked about earlier on. It's natural variation in the way we say these things. So the more tokens you've got, the more replicates you've got of a particular vowel, the better. It enables you to be a bit more precise about that speaker's vowel formants, that speaker's acoustics.
But then again, in a police interview, somebody may well speak very differently from how they were to their mates while committing a crime or planning a crime. How do you then compare those two examples of recorded language?
You're perfectly right. And people speak very differently under formal circumstances, like a police interview, from what they're doing when they're chatting with their mates. And quite often, the formality of the police interview will mean that you're going to have to say, I can't compare the suspect with the offender's voice that's speaking over the phone. I can't do it, precisely because of that within speaker variation. Also, police interview rooms are usually desperately echoic. You get reverberation, which messes up all the formant measurements, and that makes it doubly difficult. And quite often, the microphone is nearer the interviewing officers than the suspect. So you get really good recordings of the interview officers, but not of the suspect. So usually police interviews are not much good. What is good is if you have, let's say, telephone recordings from remand or something like that.
Can you give us an example of one of the cases you worked on that there was a car bombing case? Can you talk about that?
It sounds awful, doesn't it, car bombing, but especially in the times that we live. But it wasn't a terrorist thing or anything like that. It was in 2017, I think. 3 lads hopped in a car and drove to Wagga, where they blew up a car belonging to one of their mates, I think. And 2 of the lads stayed in their car, and the other one set the explosives. And the whole thing was videoed on one of their mobile phones, and there was also a verbal commentary to it as well. I think they were hoping to post it on social media of some kind. You know. Anyway, the police were interested. Then they had a recording of one of the lads saying, "This cunt is absolutely fucking bonkers." That's quite an interesting utterance, you know, if you want to say, oh, well, what's the meaning of that? And but anyway, that's not the meaning is not really what
it's very consonant heavy. That was my first thought.
Yeah,
it's very consonant heavy.
Yeah, there were 2. The vowel sounds in that were not much use because and o don't give you typically good strengths of evidence. We know this, right? So you're likely to get a likelihood ratio of 1-to-1, which is useless evidence. Just as likely to get it if it's him than if it's not him. But there was an S sound in absolutely, which was very pronounced, and there was a Z sound in at the end, bonkers. And I thought it was worth doing the comparison using those, in particular the S sound, because some previous experiments had shown that S can have, the acoustics of S can be associated with fairly strong strength of evidence. And so there were three fairly long police interviews with the 3 suspects, and the police wanted to know who said the absolutely fucking bonkers, because that would mean that they were not the person who laid the explosives. So it was interesting from that point of view. It was an exculpatory exercise rather than an incriminating one. So we had 3 long recordings, police interview recordings, where the 3 lads spoke very, very naturally, and so it was possible to take the exculpatory S and compare it with more S's than you can poke a stick at from each of the speakers in the police recordings. And as luck would have it, and it really is luck, the 3 lads had very different ways of saying their S. One of them, for example, had a whistled S, so they would say something like, yes, and one of them was like, yes, 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 and the other one was yes, yes, yes. So they were very, very different S's. And so it was pretty easy to compare the exculpatory S with the S's in the 3 lads and say, well, you're far more likely to get this exculpatory S if it had come from this lad than the other 2. Way, way more likely. And the police then were able to use that. I don't know on what basis they took one of the other 2 and charged him, and he confessed just before the trial. So that was quite interesting, because a single S is a very, 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 very short amount of evidence. You can't usually use that sort of thing. It lasted for something like 10 centiseconds or something like that. You need a lot more evidence usually.
You did mention a case of the Palestinian protest, and the implications of that are quite significant. If you're charged with a hate crime and inciting violence, that's obviously a heinous crime. How on earth do you go about confirming or establishing what was actually said on a recording?
In pretty much the same way as you do with forensic voice comparison, the same conceptual framework, okay? So you have competing hypotheses. So in forensic voice comparison, your competing hypotheses is the suspect said the offending speech and somebody else said the offending speech. And then you have the evidence. So for a disputed utterance, you have competing hypotheses. So the crowd were chanting, "Gas the Jews." The crowd were chanting, "Where's the Jews?" And then you have the evidence, which is the speech acoustics. Right? So what you have to say, just in the same way as you did the likelihood ratio for the forensic voice comparison, you have to say, what's the probability of getting the acoustics, which you can measure, assuming the crowd were chanting, "Gas the Jews," and what's the probability of getting the same acoustics, assuming the crowd were chanting something else like, "Where's the Jews?" And because you know typical acoustics of gas versus where's, you can say, right, you're far more likely to get the acoustics that we can see if it was where's than if it was gas, or the other way around, of course. And there was another case way back, which is a bit more well known, the famous David Bain murder case, where a young lad, I think in those days, came back from his newspaper round in New Zealand and found his family, according to him, they found his family murdered, had been shot, and he made a telephone call to the emergency services in which he was understandably sounded very, very upset, and the police charged him with the murders, and he was found guilty, and he'd served, I think, about 14 years when the case was appealed. Finally, it went all the way to the United Kingdom, and the court there found that the finding was unsafe and ordered a retrial. And the police listened again to the emergency services call and heard Bain say, "I shot the prick." And that sounds like a confession. And the defence then, of course, sent it to lots and lots of experts and said, "Well, what do you think was being said?" And you can listen to this on the web. If you Google it, you'll be able to hear the actual emergency services call, and it's extremely difficult to make anything out at all. But most people said, "Oh, it sounds more like I can't, or I can't breathe," rather than "I shot the prick." And so what you ended up there with was the hypotheses, the two hypotheses. One of them is Bain said, "I shot the prick," and the other one is Bain said, "I can't breathe." And that boiled down then really to a comparison between sh and k. And then you go to the acoustics, the bit that corresponded to the sh or the k, and you have a look at them and say, right, what's the probability of getting these very indistinct acoustics assuming that he said sh, and what's the probability assuming that he said k? And it was considerably more likely that you'd have got the acoustics assuming he'd said k than sh. In the end, this evidence wasn't led, which is partly a good thing, partly a bad thing, because there was other evidence. I think the father was having an incestuous relationship with the daughter, and that wasn't led, for some reason or other, it wasn't led at the first trial, that evidence. And that meant that there was another person who might have been responsible for the murder, i.e. the father, than Bain. So you've got reasonable doubt straight away. And then Bain I don't think it took the jury very long to exonerate Bain the second time round.
Is all of this telling us that ear witnesses are very unreliable?
Yes. Or you have to be careful, right? And it's one of the reasons why you don't ask, or it's sensible not to ask, what did you hear? It's sensible not to ask an expert, "Oh, what did you hear then? What did you hear then?" Because different people will hear different things. And you can't do much with that, right? That's why it's sensible to turn the question around and say, what are the different things that people are hearing? Those are my different hypotheses. In the Bain case, there were lots and lots of different hypotheses. The other thing which always messes things up, and you have to be very, very careful about, is we can be primed very, very easily to hear with an indistinct utterance. You can be primed to hear whatever somebody really wants you to hear. So with the pro-Palestinian protest, the video of that crowd chanting went viral, and that video had "Gas the Jews" written on it. And of course, if you see "Gas the Jews" and you listen to it, that's what you will hear, absolutely. The more indistinct the thing is, the more power the priming has. And that is why you must never, ever tell anybody what you think was being said.
In terms of the science moving forward with AI, how is AI affecting forensic speech analysis?
That's a really good question, isn't it? Still too early to say. One of the things that's absolutely clear is that the science of forensic voice comparison is getting better and better thanks to, you can say, AI. Because if you think, for example, 10 years ago, if you wanted your mobile phone to understand what you were saying to it, so we're talking here speech recognition rather than speaker recognition, but if you wanted your mobile phone to understand what you were saying to it, you had to train it on your voice. Nowadays, you don't. And that's an amazing, recognizing speech is an amazingly complicated thing. And the fact that our technology can do that nowadays is a testimony to how good the technology is. And quite recently, let's say, I think in 2017, the latest version of automatic speaker recognition software with deep neural networks started to be implemented. and showed not a particularly big improvement, but an improvement nevertheless on the previous approaches. And that's being implemented now for speaker recognition in a lot of contexts. And you have to say that it's incredibly powerful. The only thing is that nobody knows how it works. And that's a bit of a problem in science, because science is about understanding how things work. Another aspect where AI or our technology, I'd rather say our modern technology, it comes into play is with deep fakes, of course.
Yes. Well, one example, voice theft, because Stephen Fry was recently talking about the fact that his voice narrated a book he's never read. How is that going to affect your work? Deep fakes and voice theft, for example.
Yeah. Or more pertinently, you can imagine a scenario, I don't think it's happened yet, but it's going to happen, where the defence is going to say, that's not my client's voice, it's a deep fake. And that really does put us in it, I think, at the moment. So the question is, how well can you tell a real voice from its deep fake? And of course there are people working on this. And the trouble is, of course, when they've sorted out how to do it, then the predator-prey relationship in evolution is going to mean that the deep fakers are going to get even better. And it's going to go round and round and round.
There was a telephone fraud case that you worked on. Can you talk about that?
Yes, sure. This is another one where we got a result, thank heavens, after a lot of hard work. In, I think, 2003, imagine 2003, Christmas Eve, the investment bankers JB Morgan Chase got a fraudulent fax instructing them to transfer $150 million from an account that they were running to various bank accounts in Switzerland and Hong Kong and Greece, I think. And 10 minutes before closing time on Christmas Eve, they got a telephone call requesting a callback on that fax. Now, a callback is where the person requesting the transference of the monies just runs through the monies to be transferred and checks that it's all correct and then says, yes, go ahead. It's amazing that it's as sloppy as that, isn't it? You'd think that there would be a bit more control over it. But anyway, they had the telephone call, and this person said, "Look, I've been trying to contact people on another line. Could you do a call back for me on the fax that I sent earlier on today?" And you have a recording of the person at JB Morgan Chase saying yes. And so, looking at the fax, we are to transfer to Hong Kong Power Limited, and the bloke says yes. So that's $118 million. And the button is pushed and bong, out goes the money. Now, as I said, this was quite a brilliant fraud, really. And so I think that it was the Commonwealth superannuation scheme, the monies belonging to that, which then went out into the ether. And the police somehow or other identified a suspect, and they had quite a lot of recordings of the suspect talking to his mates. And the actual incriminating recording to JP Morgan Chase contained, like I was saying before, quite a few vowels that you can use, and also the expression "not too bad," said with a particular intonation. So, duh, 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 which is one of the ways we say it. "Oh, how are you doing? Not too bad." And this expression occurred in lots and lots of calls with his mates. So I was able to compare the "not too bad" in the incriminating phone call with the suspect's "not too bad" examples. And also, again, as I explained earlier, you have to say, okay, so what's the probability of getting this incriminating not too bad, assuming it's come from the suspect. Well, they were very, very similar. So the probability of getting that not too bad, assuming it had come from the suspect, was quite high. But of course, you then have to say, right, what's the probability of getting that not too bad, assuming it's come from someone else? And that meant then going and collecting data from Australian males of a certain age, saying not too bad, many, many, many times. The good thing about it is that you can elicit that quite easily by just saying, okay, you line up your reference population, your reference speakers, and you say, right, I'm going to phone you up and I'm going to ask you lots of questions, and I want you just to answer not too bad to each one of them. So you phone them up and you say, how are you doing? They say, oh, not too bad. How's the weather outside? Oh, not too bad. You get lots and lots and lots of not too bads. And then you can measure those and you can say, what's the probability of getting the incriminating not too bad, assuming it's come from somebody else? And so that took about 3 months. And that allowed me then to get a likelihood ratio for the evidence, the strength of the evidence, which was very, very, very big. You're many, many, many times more likely to get that not too bad, assuming it had come from the suspect than assuming it had come from somebody else. And that went to trial. There was a lot of other evidence. This was, I guess, a very small part of it. And I had to try and explain this to the jury. I've tried to explain it to you, and I'm sure you and your listeners can understand. It's not desperately easy to take in all at once, right? And it's not worth trying to go into the statistics and the idea of a likelihood ratio, and even the value of the likelihood ratio, which was something like, 300,000 times more likely assuming it was him than if it wasn't. All you could say is, look, you're very, 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 very much more likely to get this agreement assuming it was him than assuming it wasn't him. But please, I'm not saying it's 100 times more likely to be him. That's something different. And just leave it at that.
Well, of course, in Australia, Christmas Day is a public holiday, as is Boxing Day the next day. So, and if it falls on a weekend, well, then you can have 4 or 5 days without business activity.
That's why it was rather clever, you know. If I was going to do that, I'd choose Christmas Eve too, hey?
Or copied someone else's voice.
Yes, I've got a deep fake.
Thank you so much for talking about something that I've seen but I didn't know a whole lot about. And I think my big take-home message is going to be that ear witnesses aren't necessarily reliable. So what we hear isn't necessarily what was said. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Crime Insiders Forensics is a LiSTNR original production. It's hosted by me, Catherine Fox, and produced by Holly Mitchell and Ed Gooden. Sound design and imaging is by Link Kelly.